Yes.
love these classes. We learn a lot.
I'm glad. I'm
And for any of these classes, I learn a lot.
well, thank you very much for saying so. That means a lot to me. The rest of these people give me nothing. They give me no support. They say nothing to me after my coursework. Mm-hmm. I'm glad. That's what they're for. Good. 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 Yeah. I'm sorry. Not everybody's geared up for that, you know. Well, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thank you. And I hope I have something to offer tonight. Good evening, ladies and germs. The sheep and the goats, eh? Come on in. Come on in. No, you won't be. Just barge in there. Tell Mike to move over. That's fine. That's fine. All right. Enough of this goats and sheep stuff. You're making me hungry. It was a joke. It was a small joke. All right. Week 4. Ta- How do I interpret that? Ta-da. Yahoo! Yahoo! The God Yahoo. The sign-in sheet is out there somewhere. I urge you to sign in multiple times with different names so that the powers that be will think I'm more popular than I am. So the tale of two stories, right? I keep hammering this home, but this is the collision, isn't it? The first is found in the Jewish book of Exodus about the escape of foreigners from Egypt. And the second is an historical Egyptian account about the expulsion of foreigners from Egypt. Two very different concepts of the same event, isn't it? One is pulling you forward with a leash, and the other is kicking you out with a boot. All right? And each are involving an Egyptian prince. One is named Moses, and the other is named Moses. Wow, is that not similar? Moses, in Egyptian, essentially means moonborn, born of the moon, or of the moon. It's lunar. It's lunar. Moses is a double lunar because the god in Egypt is the lunar god. So it's a double moon of the moon, all right? And just like the Egyptian pharaoh Tutmosis is named after the god we would call Thoth, which is the god of education, the god of knowledge. Thoth, Moses. Thoth, born of the moon, moonborn. So it's a very popular name, and it has to do with that. Guten Abend. Wie geht es heute? He didn't say anything back, and he speaks fluent German.
What does that mean?
Guten Abend, wie geht es heute? Good evening. Good evening. How are you this evening?
Sorry, I need a zipper.
Sehr gut. Alles geht's gut. Yeah. So Matt and I are going to teach the whole class in German tonight. Matt, come on up. Come on up. Herr Meisterheim. Ich will, danke, aber nicht jetzt. So, and we have this very common name, all right? Somehow or another, they're in both. I think that's fascinating that they're in both. I think it's quite telling that they are. So, our biblical, which is in our blue line, and is in Exodus, right? Meanwhile, as my father would say, meanwhile, back at the ranch, my sister Katie used to go down rabbit holes in conversation so far that we didn't know what we were talking about afterward. My father eventually would say, meanwhile, back at the ranch. So meanwhile, back in Midian, What's in Midian? The Mount of God, right? It's where they all went to. Last we checked in with Moses, Aaron, his brother, and a gajillion sons of Israel. They were all safely out of Egypt through the Yam Suf, the wilderness of Shur. That's a lot to be through. And finally at Moses' favorite vacation spot, Midian and the Mount of God. It's like the Wisconsin Dells. It's like the Dells, right? And I think this mountain is somewhere in the American Southwest, but it's good for this with this crazy cloud on top of it. Might even be from, what was that crazy movie where the Devil's Tower and that was Encounters of the Third. It might be from that, but I think it was helpful. So anyway, they get there, and God's not too impressed with these people. And while Moses is 40 days on the mountain, there's that magic Jewish number again, 40 days. He's back up on there. Everybody's down at the base of it. Moses is up there in this cloud, okay? And Moses has to convince. He does a lot of convincing during this time period. He convinces God to stay with him, to be okay, give it a shot. Because he keeps calling them stiff-necked people and rough-necked people, and he's not happy about them, all right? And conversely, having been ignored by this God for nearly 500 years since Abram, the mass of people weren't particularly impressed with God either, all right? They were not happy with the vacation spot. It's not what they'd signed up for. Now, taking religious matters into their own hands, they melted down the gold. Remember all that gold that they plundered the Egyptians with? Okay? They melted all that down into a golden bull to worship and threw a huge party when it was finished. A golden bull. Well, what a choice. Why would they choose as their object a golden bull? Surely it's something that they had some idea of before, wouldn't you think? I mean, Mike would out of the blue, that you would fashion for yourself a religious entity to worship that was based on an anteater? You would use something else, probably not an anteater. Not that a bull is an anteater, but they chose something specifically. And there we have it from artwork. It's hardly a desert, but and everyone is oddly dressed for a much later period in Greek artwork. Renaissance had that problem. But there, nonetheless, is our golden bull, all right? Just then Moses reappears in the middle of the party, carrying stone tablets upon which God himself had written 10 laws, 10 mitzvot, laws in Hebrew, that they were to obey. Upon seeing this party, he unleashed his own disappointment upon them, and he hurls the tablets down to the ground where they shatter, right? Remember that? All of us were there, right? It's right in front of us. I wonder who his wig and beard designer was. Boy, has anyone ever looked like that? It's the movies. It's the movies. Then he has to trudge back up the mountain to get a whole nother set, right? He's got to go back up and get another set. Now, after this, he's very angry, and he announces that killing every man, woman, and child is what they all deserve. Do you know that? He says, I'm done with these people, and he threatens to kill them all, okay? Well, Moses has got a bigger problem now, and again, he managed to calm God down and gets a whole new set of 10 laws. So he's been up there another round of days up there, and he gets another set of tablets, okay? And down he comes. Whew, such drama. Such drama. Great stories, right? Grandpa, tell us a story. That's a good story to tell. Good story to tell. There's Charlton. Boy, he's impressive. I wonder what those things on his wrists were for. I think they're for show. I don't think they're for anything. Maybe he left them on from, what was the... No, not Spartacus, the chariot movie. Ben-Hur. I think he just forgot and left them on. So Moses returns with the new tablets, and the people, now chastened for their actions, settle in as Moses reveals more of what is expected of them. And there's lots. The people are separated into family groups based upon which of Yaakov's 12 original sons they were related to. Can you imagine that? 4 million people milling around. They hadn't invented megaphones yet, okay, or cones. And they're all told to, well, you sons of Dan, you go over there. And it had to have been quite a task for that many people to find their places, distinct places on the plain. And this was according to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Okay? They're all in groups, huge groups, all right? And grouped accordingly, it is announced that the descendants of Levi, and only they, are allowed to serve God in any direct capacity, with the top Levitic position being priests. Even the Levites were split up into 3 distinct groups, and the top of the heap are the Levites. So suddenly we've got the super group, right? Everybody else are minions, but the Levites, they're there. They're the big ones. And Moses and his brother Aaron just happen to be Levites, okay? The Levites are given specific instructions that an elaborate container, a box, be built to house the tablets of the 10 laws of God, the 10 mitzvot from the mountain. And this is the Ark of the Covenant as we know it, okay? And here's a photo of it, of the real thing. It was borrowed from the set of a film, I am told, okay? All right? And an enclosure called the tabernacle is also created to house the Ark of the Covenant above, right? So it's quite an elaborate tent. I chose a photo of a circus tent, but it wasn't exactly quite like that. But I like this one better than the ones I saw. All of which can only be handled by who? Levites. Only Levites. Only. 2 Samuel 6. When the oxen nearly overturned the ark of God, Uzzah reached out, taking a hold of it to steady it. The anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down for his irreverence. Uzzah died there by the ark of God. Who knows if the thing had shattered on the ground if it fell off? But that's not important. That's not important. Uzzah, well, poor guy, look at this. Something like that, and all for trying to help out. And Uzzah wasn't a Levite, right? Wasn't a Levite. So no good deed goes unpunished, evidently, because Uzzah just merely reached out to try to steady the thing from falling. If this is not a way to inform people, if you're a Levite, inform people, don't step on our turf. Don't come in on our stuff. You do your stuff, but nobody touch our area. So back when Moses came down a second time from his time on the mountain with God, a price was set for the people below. Okay? Ultimately, God had to have something happen with these people that he was not too impressed with. None of them would ever see Canaan, not one of them, the promised land. Only their descendants after 40 years had passed. 2 generations would pass until everyone, with exception to Moses and perhaps Aaron, but everyone had died, and their descendants would now be allowed, in greater numbers yet, 2 generations, right? In greater number yet, and they get to go into Canaan. And only until then, we decided from our timeline that it was approximately 1140 BCE, okay? And so they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Leaving not a trace, being in an area where you can't raise food. It's one of the great conundrums of biblical history, really. I mean, 4 million people out in the middle of that, waiting for the attrition of the original 4 million. Well, the next generations are born. It's pretty stiff stuff. Grandpa, tell us a story. That's a good one. Evidently, by 1140 BCE, the last of those who'd left Egypt had died, and only their fortunate descendants remained circling in the wilderness. Even Moses had angered God. Even Moses had crossed the line. And his punishment was that he could see into Canaan, but couldn't set foot in it. He died on Mount Nebo, doing just that, looking in. He was denied all that. And there's Moses looking in, right there. They got a photo back then. It was on an early camera, but it's still pretty good. All right, back to our maps. Sorry for my doing this so much, but I think it's important to be able to see. Moses leads 4 million people through the Yam Suf, Shur, into Midian, and finally to the mountain of God. All right? Remember, it takes a lot of time to do that. Finally, they're there. And at the mountain of God, he goes up twice and comes down with 2 batches of 10 commandments, and then orders the division by tribe, right? That all happens there. Then they build the ark and the tabernacle while they're there. And then they have 40 years of attrition in the desert of Shur, where they're wandering around. And then it's time to enter Canaan. And up they go. They're ready to go in, to kill everybody. Do you know that? Their orders from the great man upstairs is that they have to kill every man, woman, and child living in Canaan. That's what's required. I don't think too many pulpits are going to say that. It's kind of a downer, isn't it? It's kind of a downer. But that's what 1140 was all about. Now the fun can begin. But Moses can't go in. Moses is punished for striking a rock and having water come out of it. Okay, that's pretty bad stuff. So back to Moses and Moses, right? Now we're going to switch to the historical, our green line. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, right, we have our hero, Moses I. And he began attacking the Hyksos forces in 1540. Remember that? Driving them northward and back into the delta. There he concentrated his efforts against the capital city of Avaris and its twin city of Tanis, and by 1525, both were in ruins and their inhabitants were on the run. And there's a great depiction of Moses I from his battle axe, dealing a heavy blow to none other than a Hyksos in the north. Continuing, the delta, Avaris, Tanis, up comes Moses I from the north. He actually makes short work of all this. They're sacked, and the delta is now under the control of Moses I, of the Egyptians. First driven through the Patfi in Egyptian, of the Yam Suf in Hebrew, and ever eastward along the coastline of the Mediterranean as it curves gently northward into the southern border of Canaan, going right back where they came from a number of years before. The Hyksos take refuge in the first city they come to, a city named Sharuhen, which is very, very near present-day Gaza. That's an old place. Gaza is an old, old area. And they basically take over the city, and they prepare defenses under the nose of the occupants who live there. All right? And they set up to defend themselves against the onslaught of the Egyptians right behind them. So they're right in the pocket. They're right there. And then the first place that they can say, well, let's see if we can fend them off, they do, okay? Moses surrounds Sharuhen, and the three fate to follow those of Sharuhen. They saw what happened. They saw what happened, and they knew the Egyptians were in superior numbers. And so they closed their gates to these Hyksos refugees that are battering on the walls saying, let us in, and because the Egyptians are coming behind. And they turn them away. They absolutely turn their backs on them. They don't score much points with the Hyksos fleeing, all right? And they don't forget it. Coastal cities deny refuge to the fleeing Hyksos all along the coast. What's this coast for? What's its value? Trade routes. What are these coastal cities? They're where goods come in from they're ports. Exactly, thank you. They're port cities. Goods come in by land, from sea, from land, out to sea, all over the entire region. They're serving the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, the Ugaritics, everybody in the whole region. This is a powerhouse economy in this region. And this is worth its weight in gold. The ground is worth nothing. It's the trade routes that make it all there. With the Mediterranean to the west and access denied them from the coastal cities, the Hyksos have only one choice to avoid the approaching Egyptians hard on their heels, and they flee eastwards up into the hill and high country in western Canaan, heading eastwards. Did I say in western Canaan? In Canaan, forgive me. All right? So refugees are moving into higher country. They can't go along the coastal highway. They're denied that. And they go up into the hill and high country where nobody lives. The land is extra rotten up there. Archaeologically, there's next to no established settlements up there previous to this time period. Nobody lives up there. Nobody is up there. The Egyptians aren't concerned about following the Hyksos into these higher elevations. This is away from the trade route cities, and no one lives up there anyway, so they don't follow them up. They don't need to. They don't mind them being up there as long as they're away, okay? Egypt garrisons the entire coastal trade highway. Egyptian garrisons are all through there archaeologically, protecting this amazing area of land, okay? And up in the high country is an explosion of settlements. And they occur without any population growth in the coastal cities during this time, archaeologically. They're not being split between the cities and the high country. They're all moving up into the high country. It's the only place they can go is up there. Okay, and so they establish these settlements up there. And they are up there for good. And archaeologically, it's all over the place up in the hill and high country. Archaeology is a beautiful map of history and of time. Extraordinary. To establish a settlement? I think if you have enough people, if you have too many people, some people can stay, and the excess, they've got to go on and make their own settlement. Basically, a settlement is to find initially shelter. Shelter, that's what you initially have to do. And so they set about creating buildings out of rock and all, and of course that happens in settlements all over the world. That's what humankind does. That's what they have to do. Switching back to the biblical story of the migration of the 12 sons of Jacob in 1610, and their descendants exit from Egypt, led by Moses in 1180. Right? That's what we've studied from the dates we were given, starting with Ramses, P. Ramses, and all these dates. They're all right there. Mediterranean Sea. This is in color. It's a good one. I like this one here. Everything's in place. And there's Canaan. It's our source. And the Canaanite 12 sons of Jacob, they enter into the delta, probably along with a lot of other Canaanites. A lot of them. This is that unopposed period of time where they are flooding into the Nile Delta from Canaan. All right? They're flooding into there. Their sojourn in the wilderness for 40 years and reentry into Canaan in 1140 is going to happen, what is that? 430 years later, right? And the entire process lasts 470 years based upon their sojourn in the wilderness. 430 plus 40. Okay, so the sons of Israel leave Egypt in 1180, and they go with Moses all the way back to Midian and that mountain of God, okay? And then they're in the wilderness, right? Going round and round in the wilderness for 40 years. And finally, they're ready to go up, and up they go. Moses dies, and they enter into Canaan, according to the Bible, to take it all over, to kill every man, woman, and child. It's the process of steady migration of Canaanites between 700 and 1540 BCE, creating the Hyksos kingdom, all right? This is historical. Canaanites in Egypt. We're back to that. But this is the crux of the biscuit, right? So everything's on the map. And here it is. Unopposed Canaanites are coming in 1700 through 1540. And they're going to be there for a little while until somebody named Ahmoses I comes into the picture. And their expulsion is completed by his son Amenhotep I, and his grandson Thutmoses I, finally in 1500 BCE. And the entire process lasts 200 years. Canaanites in Egypt. And out they go. Out they go. They're expelled. Another interesting coincidence, but that's the period of time we're dealing with. How long do ancient memories last in humankind? The similarities between these two stories, one biblical and the other historical, are quite interesting, and they're worth noting. They're worth noting. We have going from Canaan to Egypt, Egypt back to Canaan, right? That's historical. And with a few little glitches, the biblical it's the same thing. From Canaan to Egypt, Egypt to Canaan. There is the structure for a deep memory. It is plausible that the 5th century BC authors in Babylon who are writing all this held on to an historical event that had been over time greatly embellished over time. The difficulties between these two stories are best exemplified by the sheer amount of supernatural descriptions found within the biblical narrative. We don't find any supernatural in the historical. We only find it in the biblical. And the merely fantastical is not included in that. There's some amazing things, right? While baby Moses being set adrift in a basket by a mother seeking to protect his life from Egyptians actively murdering baby boys, it's certainly extraordinary, but it's nothing supernatural, all right? And there we are. We have a photograph of that, okay? That'd be a hard thing to do, but if the Egyptians are killing all the baby boys, maybe it's better to send him out in a basket among the bull reeds. Nor does his being found and adopted into the Egyptian royal family, where we're told he was raised as an Egyptian prince, right? And all he knows is that he's an Egyptian, certainly. It's not until Moses is fully 80 years old, long dwelling in Midian, that the supernatural narrative begins. A divine voice emitting from a non-consumed burning bush, explaining to Moses just who he really is and the task at hand to lead his authentic people out of slavery in Egypt, and through the use of a magic staff intended to awe and compel others to comply. All right. That certainly is supernatural. It's a great story, isn't it? It's a great story. The destruction of 10 horrific plagues upon all the Egyptian population, lastly being the death of every firstborn male of any kind in Egypt, and all the while the deity that Moses now serves is actively compelling the Egyptian pharaoh to deny each and every request that Moses makes. Isn't that a strange thing? Moses is told to say, "Let my people go," and then God compels Pharaoh to say no. What could be gained from that? It's a good story. It's a good story. I remember seeing that one as a kid. Remember the angel of death in the movie? Scared the snot out of me. The eventual and free-willed order by the Pharaoh, grieving the loss of so many dead firstborn Egyptian sons, his own included, that Moses and his people finally get out of Egypt. Leave, he says. The departure of 4 million led by Moses, all heading back to Midian, only to finally have Pharaoh's chariots in pursuit and all to drown at the magic hand of Moses and his staff. It's a great story. Great story. Moses sojourning with God on a mountain while God unimpressed with the people who Moses brought, while Moses works to support their case. Okay? The divinely created stone tablets of 10 laws written by God required a second time in the face of God's new desire to kill all of those waiting at the base of the mountain. It's a good story. Times 2, right? Times 2. Remember the Mel Brooks film where he comes down with 15 laws. And he trips and one falls and he goes, 10 laws. That in the original it was 15, but he broke one of them. The magic containers, smoke that moves, divine food delivered daily, more magic from Moses' staff, and finally the green light to enter the land of milk and honey, Canaan. Great stories. What would follow as the sons of Israel enter into Canaan was wholesale slaughter and genocide of the indigenous peoples, as this God gives orders to kill them all. Kill them all. Aside from the supernatural, it is a round-trip story of Canaanites moving into Egypt and years later returning again to Canaan. The historical story also tells of Canaanites moving into Egypt and years later returning again into Canaan. And both stories are identical as to how these Canaanites arrived in Egypt, and they differ greatly in the manner by which they would return. Oh, that was a good one. Let me go back to that. Sometimes this does that. Let me try this. It's going to do it on its own. Yeah. Biggest, baddest guy on the block, aren't they? Right? For the Egyptians, Moses, biggest, baddest guy on the block. For the Jews, Moses, he's the biggest, baddest guy on the block, right? They both have this uncannily similar name that they have. The human mind has a way of changing the facts of defeat into stories of victory, does it not? Does it not? It isn't Grandpa's tell us a story about when we got our butts kicked in Egypt. It's a different story, isn't it? We see that today, don't we? We're living in this time. An election defeat is turned into a story of massive fraud that replaces the defeat with a story of victory denied by dark forces. Sound familiar? If there's one constant in the human condition, is that people will act like people. And we're in the middle of this exact thing today. And if I say it so, it must be so, right? We say it long enough, it becomes truth. Even today, all of this is really orally transmitted, right? There's nothing produced. Massive evidence is referred to over and over again. In this box, I've got all of this. It's all referred to orally, but there is nothing of substance that we find within the argument. Within the argument. So what does the argument become? Just noise. Just noise. Before the authors of Exodus wrote it all, there undoubtedly was an oral tradition, certainly. Wouldn't you think? I mean, that's how it is. Until it's written down, it's oral. In the face of historical fact, Grandpa tell us a story about anything. Anything. Defeat becomes victory, right? Defeat becomes victory. Moses didn't drive us out. Moses led us out. Coastal cities didn't deny us entry. They didn't deny us entry. We conquered everything and took it all from them. We killed them all. It's funny how history does that. Human history changes the story. Changes the story. History continues onward, doesn't it? It continues onward. The fleeing Hyksos are forced into the higher country where they settled in harsh conditions. It's not so good up there. They begin attacking the coastal cities as bands of violent guerrilla bandits. That's what happens. If there wasn't anything up there, everything was down there. And the historical proves this. It proves it. Eventually, Egypt retaliates against this. They have to. They're in control of the trade route cities. And these banditti are coming down and they're attacking constantly. These coastal cities are getting hammered. And there are letters that are sent from the Egyptian authorities in the trade route cities to the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten in his capital city of Akhetaten. All right? That's a good-looking guy, isn't it? The Amarna period was extraordinary in its art form. Changed 1,000+ years of Egyptian art form. He was a pretty unusual-looking guy, and he insisted on being depicted exactly as he was. He was an amazing pharaoh, called the heretic pharaoh. He reigned from 1353 to 1334. His name was Amenhotep IV, and he changed it to, of all things, Akhenaten. He worshipped one Egyptian god, the Aten, the sun, and he abolished all the rest of them. The entire Egyptian pantheon of gods he abolished in his reign. The heretic king, the monotheist. So, already in Canaan and newly established high country settlements, for 150 years, they were driven up into there 150 years before. So who knows what kind of mischief they were up to during that time. Maybe they were just getting going by this time. But these Hyksos, they're on the fringe Canaanites. They're no longer Hyksos because that's all over. It's been done with for nearly going on 200 years. They start making trouble for the Egyptian trade routes smooth functioning. That you can't do unless you got a weak pharaoh. All right? Written on clay tablets, later fired, these letters to Akhenaten, they survive to this day. Each is written by mayors or the ruling entities of various trade route cities in Canaan to the capital city and to Akhenaten. They survive to this day. They're called the Amarna letters. They beautiful? Fired clay, and that was the letter form of the day. Written in cuneiform, which was a very separate kind of writing which could survive this kind. Abdiheba, the mayor of Jerusalem, writes, "May Pharaoh provide for his land. The lands of the king, my lord, are deserted. Lost are the mayors. There are none remaining. The Habiru have plundered all of the lands of the king. If there are archers this year, the lands of the king will remain." Dramatic writing, but he's trying to make a point that these Habiru, nice name, isn't it? Habiru. That's the first time that this term is being bandied about. It's about bandits coming down from the hill and high country. From Yapahu, the ruler of Getzer. To the king, my lord, since the Habiru are stronger than we, may the king, my lord, give me his help, and may the king, my lord, get me away from the Habiru, lest the Habiru destroy us. It's pretty bad, isn't it? Here's those Habiru again. Back to Abdiheba, the mayor of Jerusalem. Okay, he's a pretty important guy up there. May the king give thought to this land. The land of the king is lost. All of it has attacked me. The Habiru have taken the cities of the king. Not a single mayor remains to the king, my lord. All are lost. It's a pretty bad time for the Egyptian authority in the trade routes during the reign of Akhenaten, isn't it? Wonderful that we have those. Habiru. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? It doesn't make it that, but it sounds a lot like it, doesn't it? It really does. Whoever they were, they're not from the coastal trade route cities. They're not from there. They're attacking that area, but they're not from there. They're from somewhere else in Canaan. Well, where else is there in Canaan? The only somewhere else in Canaan are the hill and high country. Who's in the hill and high country? The former Hyksos, aren't they? That's who's in the hill and high country. Who are the Apiru? They're these people. The real question is that the root of this word? It sounds a lot like it. I won't say it is, but it does sound a lot like it. So it has a little bit of a sordid beginning, doesn't it, that name? So history continues onward. During the euphoric Aten worship of Akhenaten, the further reaches of the Egyptian empire eroded considerably. He was back basking in the sunshine. And he let the reins of government go. And it took its toll. And upon his death, the traditional gods were reinstated and reestablished. Military reestablishment of former lands was regained very quickly. Very quickly, they put things to right. But they had to wait for him to die. And while a serious threat to Egyptian control of the trade route cities in Canaan, the Apiru were quelled. They didn't succeed. They attacked and attacked and attacked and probably killed and stole and destroyed a lot of things, but they didn't take over the region in spite of the language of the mayors. They continue to write. Perhaps the concerted efforts of the Apiru are the root memory of a wholesale eastern conquest of the region written in the Bible. Doesn't it say so in the Bible? Doesn't the Bible say that they came in from the east? They came in from the east, those whom Moses had led there, and they attacked from the east. They attacked westwards the entirety of Canaan, killing every man, woman, and child. Is it possible that this is the root memory of that, attacking from the east? It's possible. It's possible. It makes some sense. And the Bible continues onward. Grandpa, tell us a story about when we conquered all of Canaan from the east. Bingo. Bingo. It's kind of there. This line right here, everything established, trade route cities, the garrisons of the Egyptians, and the high country establishments of settlements, right? It's all there. And according to the letters, this is happening, isn't it? Attacking from the east. But stories get bigger and they change. It sounds better, doesn't it? Over time. Instead of a skirmish, it becomes an entire war. Instead of just bandits just hammering coastal cities, it becomes, perhaps, the conquest of the entire region that we find in Joshua. Okay, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. But we have these bits and pieces between the two. They're in both of them. In both of them. History may well be written by the winners, but if those who lost outlive those whom they lost to, the losers just may rewrite the story as they please. They might just rewrite the story as they please. When Egypt is long gone, the writers in the 5th century, in exile in Babylon, the writers set to writing a whole new story. And we believed it because it was the only history we had before archaeology and modern history as a science. And it is a great challenge and conundrum for those who desperately need to believe that the Bible is accurate history, to have history as a science challenge any of that. It could be very difficult. So what do you think of all this? What do you think? Do you think this is an interesting parallel in some points? It's not just P. Ramses, it's other things that they seem to be the root. What was your definition of mythology? Mythology points to a larger truth, that there's something to it. Mythology tends to make things into a great story. A great story. Sure. You know, the flood is an interesting one. A great one. There have been horrific floods throughout humankind, specifically between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in the Mesopotamian basin. Have been floods when both rivers have flooded horrifically, and they've left behind 12 feet of silt in some areas, okay? That's a great flood. And that was the whole world, wasn't it? In its time, the Sumerians, there wasn't anybody else around them. So when it all flooded, it was all lost, and they had to rebuild it again. That's a great root to a greater story, a much more embellished story. But there have been floods, amazing floods throughout humankind. And I don't think it's not helpful to throw the baby out with the floodwater, but to perhaps to stop and breathe for a second and ask, what are these deep memories? This deep memory of being booted out of the Delta. Somehow or another this is remembered. Because even Moses, in the biblical story, is an Egyptian prince. Now, that has no bearing on anything, does it, really, with the story? But it's there. Of all things, it's in this story too. Somehow or another, this stuck in a story and lots of other things. And then there were embellishments as well, fantastic stories. But at the end of the day, Canaanites went in, Canaanites came out, came from the same place they went back to. And then the stories build around it. But in the historical story, they were not welcomed in Canaan. They were not welcomed, and they never forgot it. They were a people set apart, and they were pretty angry at the people who lived there because they didn't invite them in. They didn't say, come into our cities and we'll be destroyed like Shadohen was before. They said, no, you can't come in. And they had to flee up into the hill and high countries. Different stories, but a lot of things make it in. Interesting how they make it in. And I hope that we've gone over a few things that are quite exceptional that have done that in this so far. Any questions, any thoughts? Only one. I can only take one at a time. Just one. No, really, no. Yes.
This is kind of a random one,
Random can be good.
but hearing your story makes me think of it. There's a museum in Istanbul.
Yep.
I think one of the former mosques, I forget the name of it, but they present as an artifact the staff of Moses.
How much do they charge you to look at it?
Well, of course, it was one of thousands of other artifacts.
Sure.
And in there, it wasn't too far from
Yeah.
the Town of David.
Yeah.
But it just struck me that with 100% seriousness and conviction, they present this.
Oh, yeah. They say that in the Middle Ages there were enough pieces of the true cross to build an entire forest of trees. My favorite was always the head of John the Baptist as a child. You can go see where Mary ascended to heaven today outside of Jerusalem. You can pay money to go to David's tomb, which happens to have been built in the 12th century during the Crusades. Most of our holy sites in and around Jerusalem were determined by Constantine's mother, who was a devout Christian, and she went, that's where it happened, and that's where his tomb was, and we've held on to those to this day for no better reason. So I hear you. We find this stuff everywhere. It's all over the place, and there are people who fervently believe that it is. I wonder how many authentic staves of Moses exist out there.
In the Duomo in Milan, there's a nail that they are convinced was one of the nails that was used in fixing Christ. And they still annually they celebrate.
Sure. And you know the pilgrims that throughout the centuries who have come to the city to pay homage to that, and the money they have spent in the cities to do that. I sang in Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and of course that was one of the great pilgrimage where people crawled on their knees in the last mile or so and all. And what a wealthy city it was throughout time, because for this reason. And the relics that are in there are astonishing, you know. Fervency aside, there was a lot of money to be made, and still money is being made on these issues. And you have to ask yourself, do they have anything to do with anything when it comes to the message of Christ? Do they? I can't find the value, but there's still a lot of money being made on all of this stuff, and have been for so long. Big business. And where's Jesus in any of that, in all honesty? Where is Jesus in that? And that's the greater question for us, is where is Jesus to any of us? To any of us? Is it this building? Does this building authenticate Christ? Does a nail? Does a piece of wood that's probably been replaced a few times in Istanbul, does that do it? I think it has to do with us, personally. And that's the greater question, and yet we are mired in this stuff. It just barely, noses are sticking out of the water for these writings. What do they mean? At the end of the day, does this matter at all? Tough. It's a tough one. Does Exodus matter at all to the message of Jesus? Does it? I can't answer that for you. I have a pretty good idea what I believe, but I think that we can just drown in this stuff sometimes. It starts to become nails from the true cross, a piece of the true cross, the true staff of Moses, and on and on and on. But at the end of the day, the message just sits there staring at us. And the message has one unique aspect to all of this stuff. It's always assigned to now, not to then. Not to then. It's assigned to now, not to then. There is the now. It's what we're living in, and we're the inheritors of this latest now. And that can be harder, can it? We can get ourselves drowning in all the stuff that people wrote a long time ago, that we look at and we say, in the modern world, I don't believe that. I don't believe that stuff. I asked you the question in the first session. I said, how many believe that the Bible is literally true? And nobody raised their hands. Not one. You might have been afraid to, but nobody raised their hands. And what's so hard about it? What's so hard for a lot of families today about stepping foot inside of a church? It's because they don't believe a lot of this stuff. And they struggle with it. They struggle with stuff that doesn't make any sense in a modern world, language that is just, it's counter to it. So, do we stay with it, or do we think about it, and do we make a concerted effort to meet them where they are? Is that a hand up? Yes.
I really want to say how much I appreciate what you said. The central thing I think you said is, what is the message?
Yeah.
And the message, I believe, is to love one another. So it has made me think of my own life and how, for many years now, I've journaled, I write a lot.
Yeah.
I keep track of things. We keep track of our own history, our children's story, our ancestor stories. We like that. That's
Yeah.
a human thing that we do.
Yeah.
I have no conclusion yet because I gotta sort this through, but it's like looking through scrims, looking through layers.
Yeah.
What's really at the heart of the matter is where along any of those now moments, including right now,
Yeah.
are we loving one another?
Yeah.
And if one of those ancient pharaohs or Moses had encouraged the people to love one another, and they had done that at any given moment, that's the moment at which we are living out our destiny as humans.
That's the kingdom of God, isn't it? Isn't that what the kingdom of God that we're told is supposed to come floating down out of the sky?
Except it explodes in the moment of now
Yes.
when we love each other.
It's a brick of the kingdom of heaven when we remember to do that. That's why my favorite, for me, it is all comes down to the Good Samaritan. He went down to the ditch. He couldn't pass by. Two other people, super religious people, couldn't be bothered. They went to the other side of the road. This nobody said, I got to go down. And he ruined his day, and he incurred a lot of expenses, probably a lot of dry cleaning, on and on and on. But he went into the ditch, and that's the kingdom of God. I think that's the message in its most tidy example in our New Testament writings. It's not magic. There's no angels, no Jesus, no God, no prayer, nothing in that story. There's a human being who goes down to the ditch for somebody else. That's how tidy it is. Were that there could have been a pile of supernatural to make it into a great story. And for that reason, it's not a great story. It's a fantastic story because it's devoid of all of these things, save the one thing. The thing we talk about all the time as Christians, choice. He chooses to go down. He chooses to care and to provide help and service to this beaten and broken man. And all he does is lose for it. He's not rewarded. He doesn't get something. He doesn't get anything out of it. He's not told, oh, and for that you get to go to heaven. He gets nothing out of it, except that he built a brick for the greater kingdom. So I thank you for your words, because that helped me to put that in. It's just, this is, I think, the question at all times is, what in the world are we even talking about anymore as Christians? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I know you said, well, how does this connect to Jesus? But for us, we are here because we have heard Jesus' message, and the message of the Good Samaritan, the message of the man. And we realize that the one who has brought us that message grew up learning these things, and from them, not taking every fact, but through his family, learned what his heritage was.
Mm-hmm.
That was what helped him to bring the message, I think, to us. And so I think it is important that we know something of the Old Testament and how that was a basis for Jesus before, because of his teaching, before his learning also. And so I see there's a connection.
Mm-hmm.
I think what Jesus taught was based on what he had learned as a child, how his family lived, what he saw, how he saw
Mhm.
love being shown
Mm-hmm.
in his own personal community and how people cared for one another.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why what he preached is what we do.
So you're saying,
How we live.
you're saying that you believe that Judaism led him to the message.
I think his whether it's Judaism or just living, learning the Torah and seeing something in there that he felt
Mm-hmm.
spoke love to him.
Mm-hmm.
That's my feeling.
Okay. And I completely respect that. I find that for me, personally, I find that the message is so revolutionary that I don't find it finding its birth in anything else. I don't find that Judaism had necessarily a kinder, more loving presence among humankind that would lead him to that. For me personally, having studied it, I find I find it easier to believe that Jesus was just a prophet of peace out of nowhere. Out of nowhere. I don't think Jesus was necessarily a product of his time. I think he was a product not of his time. I think that our prophets of peace tend to be that, and humankind tends to kill our prophets of peace. So I think it's more people who are gifted with this risky message of loving one another. Yes, ma'am.
Don't disagree with any of that, but there's this business in Egypt of all these gods, and there's something up north that's just a god, and that's where Jesus came from, that tradition of that one God.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, as a believer in the supernatural, it's important to know about that one God.
Mm-hmm.
Even when it behaves angrily, when it makes rules that are hard to follow, and so on. It's only one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big contrast with that colorful civilization.
Yeah. And yet, even to this day, we believe that God agrees with us, don't we? Yeah, I mean, there were so many sects in Judaism, because they couldn't agree on this God. The God that we know of the Old Testament is a product of the writings of Old Testament writers. They wrote who and what God was. They wrote what God could and couldn't do, didn't want, couldn't stand. I mean, they put God in their own particular box that was theirs. And is that the be-all, end-all for God, is what they said God was?
No, that's people trying to describe it as we can't.
Right, exactly. So I'm trying to fit that in with the idea of having the knowledge of God in any community. No, and I didn't mean to jump. I think that such things are so individual, and that's why I support the idea that Jesus was a super individual, and I think he just came out of nowhere with a message that just didn't work anywhere. It was the answer. It was the only answer to the same problems we deal with today. The only answer. Love one another. The only answer. If only we could state that this age is at an end. What is it? What we've always known, violence. The kingdom of God is at hand. What is it? It's not the other, it's the opposite, isn't it? Repent. Swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks. Repent, change. Attune from the age of violence to the age of the kingdom of God, which is the opposite of the age we've always known, and then rejoice in the good news. And then rejoice in the good news. And that is the mechanics of love one another. Gosh.
As we hear and read the news today, that is the answer for every situation.
Absolutely. It's not building more weapons. We have, for the first time in human history, the ability to address nearly, if not all, human suffering in the world, and yet this age is at an end. Not yet. The kingdom of God looks like addressing that. We are stuck in the patterns that we always have of this. We spend our money on other things. And I think that is, we're right back to the message. What's the ditch? It's whatever we make it. Yes, ma'am.
The ditch, the Good Samaritan concept, almost every day on various news, national, local, whatever, we see stories of someone in the role of the Good Samaritan. And often it's a first responder, which we would expect. But I have a sense that they are in that situation because they chose to be, because they have embodied the concept of love. So, okay, I'm gonna get trained to be a firefighter, or a police officer, or a social worker, or whatever, because I live this concept, I believe this concept. And it's coming out on the news all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We have these examples of the Good Samaritan all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not being grasped by the general public.
Well, who do we identify with? The guy who goes in the ditch, the two Levites, happens to be Levites, one's a priest, who look at each other and go, and go to the other side of the road. All depends on who we identify with, you know? I can't go in the ditch every single time I see a ditch, and there are times I miss a ditch when I should have gone in. And there are times I go in the ditch and it was exactly the right thing to do. And that's living, isn't it? Discernment to try to figure out what it's about. And we're imperfect in that. There are some professions where they live in ditches. Firefighters, teachers, nurses, people in these kinds of professions. Do you need to go? I think you should.
Because Courtney's taking
That's good to know. Not a problem. Good night to you, Amy. No. It's this is a big question. Well, I'm glad. Thank you. I've kept you much too long, but I'm glad we've had this discussion. Thank you. Thank you all. No, we have one more week of hell left to go. No, I'm going to beat you up some more. Thank you. Thank you.